Welcome to everybody, and thanks for joining us for this very important and timely discussion entitled NATO's Future in a Challenging New World. My name's Anne Fitzgerald, and I am the director of the Balsillie School and have the pleasure of moderating this event today. Before I introduce our guest, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Balsillie School is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. This land is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples who have cared for this land for time immemorial. We recognize the enduring presence and contributions of the Indigenous peoples in shaping the social, cultural, and economic landscape of this region as we engage in discussions in important events like this one on security and international affairs. Let us be mindful of the history and the ongoing relationships between Indigenous communities and our many global partnerships. I'd like to thank our guest speakers who have taken the time to be with us today, and I'd start by introducing our eminent panelists. Ed Arnold is a senior research fellow for European security within the International Security Department at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute in London, UK. His experience covers defense, intelligence, counterterrorism, and counterinsurgency within the public and private sector. His primary research focus is on the transformation of European security following Russia's war on Ukraine. Prior to joining RUSI, Edward was the a strategy director within the defense and security sector and an infantry officer with the British Army. Dr. Alex Lanoszka from our home team is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and the Balsillie School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo. He is also an associate fellow at the UK-based Council on Geostrategy, a senior fellow at the Ottawa-based Macdonald Laurier Institute, and a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Natalin, Poland. His research addresses alliance politics and military strategy with a focus on East Central Europe. Dr. Garret Martin is a Hearst Senior Professorial Lecturer and the co-director of the Transatlantic Policy Center in the School of International Service at the American University in Washington, D.C. And the American University is another fantastic partner of the Balsillie schools. He's written widely on transatlantic relations and Europe, both in the field of history and contemporary affairs, and focuses in particular on security, U.S. foreign policy, NATO, European politics, European foreign policy and defense, Europe, the European Union, France, and the UK. That's quite a portfolio, Garret. Okay, well, welcome to everybody. Let's kick off with the first question. Edward, I'm going to direct that to you. What implications do the current Trump administration's views on European security have, in your view, on its future role in and contribution to the NATO alliance?
Thank you, Anne. Well, I think the first thing to point out in terms of the implications and the views on European security is, I think now we have almost the real Trump administration view following the signal leak a couple of weeks ago, that they were very dismissive of Europe and European capabilities, and that is actually in contrast to what some of the US administration officials have said publicly on the transatlantic relationship and European security. And I think in the long run, that will probably help the Europeans somewhat, because they actually now they've almost finally got it that the Americans aren't joking around this time, saying that we have to focus in other areas. You need to get your act together. And I think we're seeing a lot of activity on that leading up to the NATO summit. So I think in terms of that and the US, they're really preparing the ground for these really important discussions ahead of a NATO summit to sort of get to an agreed position. But that said, I mean, I think it's most interesting to look at Secretary Hegseth's remarks from the Ukraine contact group in January, and actually he had an emphasis on working together. The main quote, I think, is, together we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and the Pacific, respectively. And I think those views are really for the US saying, we're looking into other areas. We have to prioritize China in the Indo-Pacific, you need to take Europe, and we will help you get there. And I think it's very unlikely that the US would withdraw from NATO as a member, but it might withdraw from some of the structures, command structure, etc. And I think the key part from the Europeans is not to be reactive to this, to be proactive, to say, well, if you're going to do this, and offer up solutions to the US rather than wait for the US to make an announcement and then sort of panic around it. So I think in terms of what the Europeans can do, there's certainly a lot, but we need to start giving proposals to the US rather than just waiting for them to act. Thank you.
Thank you. Garret, can I come to you now? The US has exerted leadership in NATO since its birth in 1949, and it's held key positions in the alliance too, including the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe position, which is based in Mons, Belgium. It's maintained a strong presence in Germany, and which it now intends to withdraw. What does the current US position mean at the practical level? How likely do you think is a complete US withdrawal from the alliance?
Well, first of all, let me also thank you, Anne, and the team for putting this together and for the chance to meet, albeit virtually, Ed and Alex. And also I think there's a symbolism here. I mean, we're a week away from VE Day, from the 80th anniversary of the end of the war, at least in Europe. And, that moment was really instrumental. The sacrifice of American, Canadian, English, and other soldiers really cemented this idea of this transatlantic alliance. And as the last of those soldiers are sort of, dying away and fading away, we have to ask the question of what does it mean for the transatlantic partnership and for NATO? Is there symbolism there? I would tend to agree with Ed's point, and I don't think a withdrawal is likely immediately, and for a variety of questions. I mean, there is a means to exit. There's a formal way. You can invoke Article 13 of the Washington Treaty. There's a year's notice. But there is a constitutional question over whether a president can do that unilaterally. So that's unanswered as of now. The Senate did pass a bill in 2023 saying that you would have to have congressional consultation. Ironically, with Marco Rubio being one of the co-sponsors, which would make for awkward conversations in the cabinet. So I think that question in itself might hinder in the immediate future a drastic withdrawal. The problem or the challenge is that there are a lot of other in-between options that could be very detrimental. Essentially, you could have a way where the alliance still continues, but is emptied of its importance. It is de-emphasized by the Trump administration, and that can play out in a number of detrimental ways. It can be sort of a form of empty chair, not showing up for a lot of important committee work, not participating in a lot of the military exercises that are a crucial component of creating kind of interoperability and military sort of solidarity between the allies. More drastic would be signaling that Article 5, I mean, it's already been done to a degree, but being even more clear that essentially the United States does not feel that it has to abide by Article 5 in any shape or form. That would not require leaving NATO, but the end result would still be very significant in terms of cohesion and the importance of the alliance.
Yes, indeed. Okay, well, let's shift to some of those anticipated events like developments in Ukraine and Russia. We've heard, Alex, of the three-day ceasefire announcement that President Putin has made, also references to earlier ceasefires which have not been well observed, and now the announcement of a new mineral deal between the US and Ukraine. But even these latest developments still see the US unwilling to contribute to any military-backed security guarantees for Ukraine. They see their economic investment as such. Can we really expect any NATO role on the ground in Ukraine?
It would be very difficult to foresee any meaningful NATO role beyond that, which has been the case over the course of the last few years. I would just add that the Trump administration has simply continued the line taken by the Biden administration. Even the Biden administration was very lukewarm to the prospects of Ukraine joining the alliance at the Vilnius summit some years ago. It basically resisted European calls for Ukraine to have a clear roadmap. And so I don't necessarily see much daylight between the official positions undertaken by the Biden and the Trump administrations. I think it's also important to note that given the mineral deal that had just been announced today, it appears that the Trump administration will actually continue military aid, albeit in small amounts, for the foreseeable future to Ukraine. And so I think that suggests that there may be slightly more continuity than a significant change of this sort. But with regards to the broader alliance, again, there is fracture. Some allies have been calling for peacekeepers or some sort of forward deployed force. France and Lithuania, for example, have been fairly key in that sort of line of argument, but even more supportive, or at least nominally supportive, partners of Ukraine, like Poland, have been fairly skeptical over the desirability or feasibility of such a mission, in part because they are worried about the direction of Russian aggression in the future, and they do not necessarily want to overcommit. So the alliance is a consensus-based organization, of course. It only takes one to veto an alliance decision. And so there are, of course, workarounds to the alliance of the sort that we've seen already, like the Rammstein group. But I think that suggests in general that NATO will probably remain on the sidelines as regards to Ukraine, at least in terms of what's been going on so far.
And, part of the fractures in Europe, I think, concern also the amount being spent, the percentage spent of GDP on defense. Now, the guideline is currently still 2%, but recent statements from Marco Rubio suggest that the US want NATO members to boost that up to 5%. Edward, I want to ask you, we're seeing a lot of statements coming from the UK and France about the revival of their military industrial base, but there are competing demands with stressed economies at the moment, and questions over what this means for future collective defense requirements. Give us a view on those things from the UK.
I mean, it's going to be very difficult in terms of increasing defense expenditure across the board, certainly. And I think the new Secretary General, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, was very quick off the mark in his first speech to sort of try and hedge and bracket in terms of expectations, where the US saying 5%, he's now saying sort of above 3%. I mean, the expectation is that it'll have to increase significantly. And there's a lot of nations that are already going there or projected to go there. They're not actually waiting, which is exactly what NATO really should operate under. It shouldn't wait for the slowest ally. It should actually move ahead with the times. And also, I think really significantly was a recent vote in Germany to change their fiscal rules. And I think on defense spending, quite a lot of nations has always hidden behind Germany as one of the largest economies in Europe. And now with Germany actually changing, even overnight, the EU Council has said that 16 other members of the EU plan to trigger the emergency clause, which would allow them to increase spending up to 1.5% of GDP each year for 4 years without breaching EU rules. So you're already starting to see this pretty significant shift, which I think will continue. So I don't necessarily, whatever percentage they get to and agree on at NATO and the time frame, I mean, yes, significant, but I think the point is that Europeans are already moving there and quickly. And the second part of the question is, well, the financing is one part. What do you then spend it on? And for all the changes within European security over the last few years, defense industrial cooperation has remained very sticky. And I think for the UK at the moment, we're talking about a NATO first strategy, but there's also a lot of work on UK-EU cooperation, which will obviously have a defense industrial component. And then within that context, sort of a NATO-EU cooperation, which is sort of the broader point on this. And it's a very busy time at the moment. So in the UK, we're expecting the Strategic Defence Review literally any minute, which will sort of explain the UK position on this a bit more. We have a leaders meeting of the Joint Expeditionary Force next week, the UK-EU summit, which will be on the 19th of May, and also a new national security strategy, all within the next 3 to 6 months. So I think we'll get far more clarity on the UK position. Your defence spending is increasing here as well. But in order to try and work out how best to spend that money across all of these sort of frameworks and initiatives is going to be challenging. But on the assumption that NATO first is still the predominant view, regardless of where the US position is on the alliance, then that gives you a sort of a guiding star. Now, I'm still skeptical that that defence industrial cooperation is suddenly going to unlock, but I think we always have to remember that as long as it is improving, you know, things are always going to be quite difficult when you get private sector involved in this. But I think and there has been patchy progress. The key to it is making that strategic progress across all of these organizations. But I think probably at the end of the summer, we'll be in a far better position to understand how that's going to play out.
Thank you. Alexander, can you comment on Canada's position? You know, we're over here now more exposed than ever, arguably, based on our geography, years of neglect towards defense spending, and now a newly defined relationship with the US. It seems, therefore, our membership in NATO is more important than ever. But how practical is 5% spending? In fact, how practical is operationalizing, as Ed referred to, or maybe it was Garret, operationalizing Article 5 of the Washington Treaty in the current circumstances, should Canada need that?
If Ed is skeptical over European defense industrial prospects, then
Alexander, sorry to interrupt. Can you just turn up your volume? You've
Sure.
gone a bit
No,
dead.
if Ed is skeptical over European defense industrial prospects, then I have to be fatalistic. The only way Canada can get to 5% is if there's some sort of cataclysmic event in the Canadian economy such that the denominator falls precipitously and Canadian defense spending more or less increases marginally to get to 5% of GDP. It's just not going to happen. Even 2% is a distant prospect in view of various challenges that the Canadian government faces. After all, we have been having federal deficits. We have a minority government now, and minority governments typically involve higher discretionary spending precisely because the lead party will need cross-party support to survive any potential vote of confidence. To be sure, I don't suspect any party trying to overthrow the incumbent right now for the foreseeable future due to various leadership turmoils. But the prospect of discretionary spending crowding out potential defense spending is a very real one. And I just do not think that there's much firepower available, at least fiscally, for Canada to really undertake meaningful steps towards improved defense expenditures. Now, of course, Prime Minister Carney has talked about increasing Canadian defense expenditure to get to 2%. It'll be hard. He is, I think, a fiscal conservative by nature. And there are these considerations that I mentioned at play. Of course, the geopolitical environment has only gotten worse. But I think we can only expect rather modest increases for the foreseeable future. And I'm afraid that some of the harder decisions are going to be deferred for as long as the government can do so, precisely because the guns versus butter trade-offs are just going to be very intense for the foreseeable future.
Well, let's talk about those wider geopolitical issues, Garret, and the prospect of the trade war with Europe. Will this hinder, in your view, NATO's ability to have a common front towards China? And based on your answer, how will NATO tackle China, and can we expect a continued rapprochement between the alliance and the IP4 countries?
Yeah, thank you. And I would mention also 2 quick points just before that. You know, 5%, if 5% became the new guideline, that would require the United States to spend an extra $560 billion, roughly. So that's a staggering amount. That would be an interesting challenge when you're trying to cut spending.
Yeah.
And I I also just found out Mike Waltz is stepping down, so there's always a national security advisor. So you see, the real world is interrupting all our conversations constantly. No more, signal leaks for all of us, unfortunately. So on a more serious point, I think that the question of China and tariffs, I think, is fundamental, because I don't believe we're in a situation where we could neatly segment or separate what's happening on the trade front and what's happening in the security front. There's obviously, and I don't need to tell our Canadian friends, that there's uncertainty about where exactly the trade war is going. But on the premise that we are likely to see some sustained forms of tariffs imposed both on the European Union and other allies, that is going to have and on China, that is going to have all kinds of negative repercussions, I think, in terms of the general atmospherics. That's the first element. But the second is, if China cannot trade or export to the United States, the challenge for them is to find other markets. And I think there's a real concern in Europe and beyond that they will try to flood these other markets with these products that they can't export to the United States. So I think that's going to create, I think, significant tension. I think the second element is there had been some convergence between Europe, the EU, Europe, and the United States insofar as how to approach China. I think my sense is that, broadly speaking, with some exceptions, the Europeans were moving towards a more hawkish line towards China. I sense that if the United States is engaging in those kind of coercive measures, it's more likely to accentuate some of the internal divisions in Europe as to how to approach China. I'm not saying that suddenly it's going to be like a reversal of alliance. There's nothing that drastic, but I think it's going to slow down that momentum to try to come up with common approaches to deal with some real challenges that China poses, both in the economic and the security field. And I think the same issue applies to NATO. The United States had been an important driver of putting China on the map of NATO. I mean, the first time that NATO formally talks about China in an official declaration is 2019, under the pressure of the United States. Of course, the war in Ukraine and China's help, being an enabler of the Russian effort, has also kept China as an important element. But there's still a lot of unresolved questions about what exactly does it mean for NATO to pay attention to China. There are real divisions as to whether it means only focusing on Europe and Chinese activities in Europe. Does it mean being more active in the Indo-Pacific? Those are real existing lines of division. The risk is that they would be exacerbated even further if we have a worsening of relations between Europe and the United States over a number of subjects. I think also from the perspective, from the demand side, if you're looking at the so-called AP4, the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific 4, the question is, if they see the United States being more friendly with Russia, if they see the United States blowing hot and cold over tariffs towards China, I also suspect that their interests, or if the United States is less involved in NATO, I suspect their interest in having that closer political cooperation is likely to also wane in the same manner.
So, Edward, let's talk about the UK's position amidst these tensions and this precarious emerging relationship between the EU and the Trump administration. We see a lot of analysts talking about it being kind of caught between taking a closer stance with Europe or a closer stance with the US. But the British and the US have always had a strong defense relationship. I remember well working at the Defense Academy in the UK. And within NATO itself, and the British have always been strong at defense diplomacy, what has been known as. So is this going to play a role here in the current circumstances, or do you think the focus will need to be on Britain acquiring new, or Britain and Europe acquiring new weapon systems, including air defense and long-range missiles, et cetera, which are in demand for security guarantees at the moment in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of the capabilities that you just mentioned, yes, the Europeans have to increase it when you look at sort of potential capability gaps in the NATO regional plans, where now US capabilities are probably written in pencil rather than pen. There's significant gaps that the Europeans are just going to have to do. That is something that they would have had to have done anyway, regardless, if Harris had won the election. I think it's more just a question of timeframes now of when the Europeans would be far more comfortable with their overall defense capabilities. And in terms of the UK, I mean, yes, especially on trade as well, there's been this question mark, and the Prime Minister has been pretty clear at the moment, or trying to be as clear as he can, to say that, well, we're not going to choose, it's not a binary choice for the UK between the US and the EU. But actually, I mean, his comments around that were before the Liberation Day tariffs came into effect, also far more, aggression against UK allies, principally Canada, also Denmark over Greenland. And actually polling within the UK strongly suggests that the electorate want closer relations with the EU in this current context. So I think that's going to sort of start to pan out in terms of policy. Then in terms of defense diplomacy, I think the relationship with the UK, I mean, it's not just on the defense side. I mean, I think the intelligence relationship is probably one of the most sort of difficult aspects of this now, both in terms of the bilateral, which is the most important, but also Five Eyes relationship as well. And I know that there's a lot of hesitancy over in the UK about sort of how they approach that relationship. But also I think there are real limitations to what the UK can do in defense diplomacy. I mean, you say traditionally the UK has been very good with it in terms of its relationship with the US, and it's still strong, but it is dwindling. I mean, the UK is not able to support the US military like it once was. It's still struggling to operate at the divisional level, which we assessed 10 years ago was probably the most valuable to the US. Both in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US had to bail the UK out in the south of both of those countries, where we had defined AO to say, well, we'll take the south, and they had to come in and get us. So that sort of shows that operationally we're not as valuable. And there's been, I mean, I've lost count of the amount of US generals who have publicly stated that they are pretty annoyed, especially with the British Army, that if its capabilities are just not up to scratch. And specifically in terms of capabilities that they heavily rely on the UK, for example, in special forces. Well, the special forces are going to dwindle as your your overall numbers dwindle, because that's the pool that they select from. So I think if the UK wants to be more serious in terms of defense diplomacy with the Trump administration, they actually have to rectify all of these issues, and very, very quickly. And that's the sort of the challenge at the moment. I mean, to do that quickly, it's very, very difficult to do. I mean, just take army numbers. It's not a question of saying, well, we want to go back up to 100,000. Here's the money to do so. When you look at things such as recruitments and retention, all of the numbers are going in, a downwards trend, and money will help. But it's, we've actually got to do something else to start to arrest those trends.
Garret, what might a disengaged US mean for the nuclear umbrella in Europe?
That's it's a fundamental question, because we, in all of the different scenarios that we've spoken to, or we can anticipate or imagine in terms of arguably at the very least a less engaged US. I think what seems more certain is at least the number of American troops stationed in Europe is likely to go down. I think we're close to 87, I believe. So we know that's likely to happen. The question is, what happens to the nuclear weapons that are stationed in 5 European countries? In a more, I think, extreme case, over the course of the next few years, if the United States is really fundamentally washing its hands from European security, we could imagine a situation where the United States, takes back also its nuclear weapons. And then that, I think, will really ask a lot of really difficult questions for countries that have really relied or believed in the importance of the nuclear umbrella. We have heard already whispers, we've heard sort of different voices speak to that possible scenario. I'm thinking about Friedrich Merz, the new German chancellor. We've also seen that being expressed by Donald Tusk in Poland. So I think that would be one of the questions is, would the incentives towards increased proliferation go up in that scenario? And I think that can't be discounted. We're also in a broader situation where a lot of the guardrails against proliferation, the guardrails around nuclear arms control, have really fundamentally deteriorated over the years. So I think that's one big concern. The second is, could you imagine some kind of substitute? I mean, there's been talks about, can you Europeanize the existing nuclear deterrence? That would be the UK and the French one. That would present a number of challenges. I mean, I think they would present some challenges in terms of asymmetry. I know, of course, the UK and France have hundreds of nuclear deterrents. They do not have the same capacity than the United States. It would require some difficult debates about doctrine. I mean, right now, the French doctrine, for instance, is mainly about national interest. That could be elastic to suggest that there would be crucial territories around France that would also fall under the umbrella. But the old question about nuclear doctrine, when would you be prepared to risk having Paris attacked and destroyed to defend Riga or Tallinn? That's a difficult question, and that would have to be answered. So I think we're not at that point. I don't think we're necessarily yet where a situation where the US nuclear umbrella would be removed, but I think it's important to have the conversation that we're seeing to prepare for those scenarios in European capitals and not just wait and see.
Alexander, you do a lot of work on military technologies, and I think many of us are thinking at the moment in addressing economic pressures and our defense spending levels, both for national purposes and collective security purposes. We need to think more about dual usage technologies. And the Balsillie School is very interested in technology governance, the governance of those transformative technologies. What sort of new technologies do you think are essential for national purposes, but also as an offering to allies for collective security?
Well, to be sure, Canada has certain capabilities in cyber, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing, especially given that we're at the University of Waterloo. We have those capabilities literally on campus. And so there's certainly some promise there where we can build upon certain bilateral relationships of the sort that Carney had cultivated already in his visit to London in these particular areas. So I can easily envision greater cooperation as regards to the so-called emerging disruptive technologies. That being said, I do not think we should be too taken by the allure of these technologies. I think Canada faces much more fundamental problems as regards to military power. We produce upwards of maybe 3,000 to 5,000 rounds of ammunition per month. We've only very marginally increased ammunition production since 2022, far short of what we really need for any sort of high intensity, large scale combat. Indeed, our production numbers are not very sufficient to help Ukraine meaningfully. Ukraine consumes about 60, 70,000 rounds of ammunition per month to defend, let alone go about counteroffensive operations, which will, of course, require a much higher expenditure. And so I think the needs are much more basic. We barely have coverage for our own airspace. In terms of the fighter jets at our disposal, I think you can count the number on one hand, as a matter of fact. And so as much as we should think about those other technologies that we mentioned at the outset of this particular phase of questioning, I think we should still be mindful of how more traditional, less sexy bits of military technology still remain absolutely essential for us to generate military power in a manner that's meaningful for the alliance and for Canadian national security more generally.
Thanks, Alexander. And before I defer to some questions from the audience, and I would encourage our members of the audience to log questions if they do have them, let me take that question to Edward and Garret as well, this balance between conventional defense capability and new forms of defense capability to fight the new wars, bearing in mind that we have not just 3 domains now, we have 5 domains, right? Land, sea, air, cyber, and space. Give us a perspective, Garret, from the US. We're hearing about the new Iron Dome proposal. We're also hearing about Hegseth's plans to cut defense spending and make cuts in the Pentagon. So, give us your thoughts on the US position.
Well, this is a little bit outside of my area, so I don't want to be pretending that I have any great insights, but I think it's, there's an element here where there is a certain tension from sort of a layman's perspective here between, on the one hand, I think the desire to clearly sort of want to cut spending, in light of the agenda being pushed by Donald Trump and Elon Musk. On the other hand, I think the need to continue to modernize the armed forces, to also very much not fall behind in the sort of important race for AI development. I think it's important because, and I know you obviously do a lot of great work on this in Balsillie and elsewhere, but I think it's also important because this is a domain where you really have dual use. So I think the general benefits of investing in AI would extend well beyond just the military domain. So I think there's a real imperative here in terms of continuing to maintain the US and others as sort of pillars of innovation to not sort of neglect that element. If there's also very much a pivot towards or a greater focus on China and the Indo-Pacific, I think that's another area where that's going to be important. I would say also this matters, and it matters also within the context of NATO, because the players in that type of innovation drive are very different than they would have been in the past. Like, it's very different to develop new sort of an F-35 or new tanks. The type of companies you work with are well established. Here, if you're thinking about the players in terms of sort of tech innovation, it's much more private sector. It's much more sort of Silicon Valley. They're not necessarily companies that think in the same manner about national security and defense. They don't necessarily have the same types of incentives. So developing good working habits with that industry, I think, is going to be crucially important to continue innovation for the US, but of course, for many other actors beyond.
Thank you. How about from your perspective, Edward, like the balance between what would be the areas of technology that the British would prioritize in their defense spending surge going forward?
Well, to try and preempt the Strategic Defense Review, I mean, the issue is, in answering this from a European perspective and then a sort of a national perspective of those European nations, is, well, when do you expect to fight Russia, principally? And there's a variety of assessments. Some of the most pessimistic are within sort of 2 years. So, I mean, if you take a rough average of what's been said, you're still talking within the remainder of this decade. So if that is true, then you actually have to go for technologies which are probably available, and also look at a lot of data. And the 2 data points are, firstly, well, how is this, these weapon systems performing in Ukraine? And, we're getting a lot of reports out of Ukraine to say that actually Western supplied, for example, drones they're not very good because they don't know how to defeat Russian electronic warfare. And the tactical adaptation cycle in theatre at the moment is between 6 and 8 weeks. So it's very difficult for the Europeans. I mean, that is fundamentally changing their procurement model to be able to sort of keep up with the pace of change. But we have that data that the Ukrainians are able to provide, so we've got to use it. And, a lot of the new sort of centers that are in support of Ukraine, that is exactly what they're for. They are supporting Ukraine, but we need to make that conduit working both ways. So what was set up after the NATO Washington summit last year, I mean, it's critical to say what works and what doesn't work. And I think the second data point is also, how are the Russians adapting? So it's no good sort of looking at sort of 2022 Russian military, because the Russian military is completely different today than it was just 3 years ago. So we need to start to make assessments of how they are likely to fight. And the sort of the critical areas at the moment are obviously manpower. It's very, very difficult for them to sort of re-equip and make sure that that manpower is able to conduct offensive operations, which are the more challenging military tasks. But there's also issues around their own technology. So, for example, their most modern tanks, they don't compartmentalize their ammunition. So until they change their blueprints of their design of their tank, then an MLAW is going to be absolutely wonderful against Russian armor. So we don't need to do anything else to it. We just need to have lots of them. So it starts to become a volume game. In the UK context, the two biggest programs that we currently have, Tempest, Next Generation Fighter, and the AUKUS Trilateral with the US and Australia. Both of those programs are completely irrelevant to UK defense if we go to war with Russia in 28. So there has to be this prioritization. And then in terms of the echelon, I still think, in terms of Europe, brigade is the level of currency that you need from a military perspective. So for the Europeans, it's how many full combat capable brigades that you can get out of the door is probably in the short term. Let's forget about divisional core structures, all of that, brigades that can move. And that's probably sort of where you want to aim for. They have to obviously be fully equipped, full of personnel as well, probably at about 120% manning because of the potential attrition rates we're getting to.
And have the tariffs or the threat of tariffs, depending on what direction they're going to go in for the UK, has that made defense expenditure on capability now more expensive based on parts and raw materials that need to back them?
Yes, but I mean, not more than, for example, the reduction in the pound after the Brexit vote of 2016, and then also inflationary pressures did after 2022. So these are just things that you're going to have to deal with. They're always going to fluctuate. I mean, that sort of brings me back to my earlier point about thinking about these things. The problem is that we think about procurement in terms of decades and fixed price costs, etc. And that is generally why programs take longer to get in and are generally over budget, because we just don't think about those issues at the moment. So there's a lot of work within the UK of doing that. But I mean, these are cultural issues as well as much as they are procedural issues. So some of those things are very slow to change. There is certainly the desire to, but whether we can actually get that sort of reform
Edward, I know you
as
have to jump
quickly
off
as
in a
it's
minute,
needed,
but before
I'm
you
pretty skeptical
go,
of.
can we just get your key message to the policymaking community? We've got a couple online with us today. So what would be your message to them, either to the US or to Canada, or hopefully for collective security purposes?
I think my main point is, from a sort of NATO members perspective, is that we just have to acknowledge that NATO is going to change probably constantly. There used to be a period where NATO would do an update to strategic concept, which would last roughly a decade. So, you'd sort of transform, there'd be business as usual, transform business as usual. I think just that is gone now for the alliance. The alliance is going to have to continually adapt. And I think, a lot of people, especially European members of NATO, are worried about the US position, and they want to keep NATO the same as they have always known it to be, because there's an emotional attachment and they get a lot of benefit out of it. I think it's more about shaping NATO for the future, acknowledging that it will change, acknowledging that the US position is going to shift, and to act accordingly. And I think that message probably needs to get in the minds very, very quickly now, just to understand sort of, I describe it as keeping NATO together in as close to its current form as possible. That's the objective, not keeping NATO as is.
Thank you so much. And Edward, thanks for being with us today. And thanks to the Royal United Services Institute for participating in this collaborative event. We wish you well and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Alexander, just over to you. key message to the policymakers?
Be proactive. This is something that Ed had already said, so in some respects, I'm just piggybacking on his remarks. But I think, especially in Canada, there's a tendency to be very reactive and not really think long term as to what Canada's global posture should be. I don't think we have that luxury anymore, although we might still pretend we do. We have to think about what the alliance should be and how Canada should play its role within the alliance, regardless as to what sort of level of support the United States will continue to provide. I generally tend to be rather optimistic that the United States will remain an integral part of the alliance, notwithstanding some changes at the margins. But all the same, do not necessarily rely on optimism. Plan ahead, think about what capabilities best serve the alliance and best serve Canadian national interests, more importantly, and to forego some of the short-termism that unfortunately has been a hallmark of Canadian foreign defense policy, at least in the last several decades.
Garret, finish us off. A key message to the policy community before we sign off today.
Well, I would first, again, echo, I think, what Alex is saying. I think there is a need to be proactive. Granted, it's easier to be said from my vantage point that when you're in the thick of it and you have to, address those issues. But I would venture a comparison that we are in a moment that is akin to the period of 1989, 1991, where we're in a period of great flux and change. What comes after is yet to be determined. But we are in a moment when the future of the transatlantic security order, the security architecture, can and will have to be redefined. So I think making sure that whether it's for Canada or other actors, that they think proactively about what they think is the ultimate or the most advantageous or the most useful principles that should underpin this new security architecture. I think that means easily, the big questions are obviously, what is the place of Russia, for instance, if any, in a sort of post-Ukraine war conflict? Is Russia going to be forever now sort of contained, set aside, a pariah, or in the longer run, do you maintain options? What is the division of labor between the United States, Canada, and Europe when it comes to defense of Europe? And what is the division of labor when it comes to addressing China? Those are fundamental questions that are going to keep policymakers busy for decades. But I think this is really a moment now to try and think from a national vantage point, what are the important guiding principles for this new security architecture?
Garret, thank you so much. And Alexander as well. Thanks to our UK partner, RUSI. Thank you to our longstanding and wonderful partner, School of International Service at the American University, and to our very own University of Waterloo and BSIA's Alexander Lanoszka. And also to the audience for being with us today at the end of term, a busy time, but I'm sure you'll agree that this was a fascinating, interesting, and critically timely discussion. We look forward to more of these, and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks for being with us today.